The dark truth never revealed about the Knights of England. The mist stretches across the hills of England like a veil woven by time itself, concealing secrets that whisper through the centuries. The silence of dawn is broken only by the distant rhythm of hooves, steady and ominous, echoing like drums of war. From the shadows, figures emerge, knights, clad in iron and steel, rising like spectral guardians of a world both glorious and cruel. To the eyes of some, they are champions of justice, defenders of the weak, chosen vessels of honor. Yet to others, they are harbingers of fear, ruthless instruments of power, whose polished armor hides ambition, betrayal, and blood. The myth has painted them as paladins of courage, immortalized in songs and poems, yet the reality was darker. Every oath sworn before an altar masked political bargains. Every sword raised in the name of faith carried not only devotion, but also an insatiable thirst for power. They were celebrated in ballads as heroes, yet in scorched villages they stood as executioners. The brilliance of their legend blinded generations to the shadows they carried within. On the battlefield, banners swayed in the wind, lances shattered enemy lines, and their thundering charges inspired both awe and terror. But behind the spectacle were exhausted men, scarred bodies, and weary horses stumbling through the mud of endless wars. Beneath the armor of steel beat human hearts burdened with contradictions, men who lived between glory and disgrace, faith and cruelty, legend and truth. Today the shining mask will be removed, the luster of myth will be stripped away, and the story retold without illusion. This is not the tale of immaculate heroes, but of flawed warriors who embodied in their very existence both the triumph and the tragedy of an era. This is the untold truth of the Knights of England. Medieval England was not born in peace, it was carved in blood. From the first Saxon invasions to the decisive Norman conquest of 1066, the island became a battlefield where cultures clashed and power shifted violently. The land itself seemed restless, divided between warring lords, rival claimants to the throne, and a church eager to expand its influence. Out of this turmoil, the figure of the knight emerged, not as the flawless hero sung in later romances, but as a creation of necessity. They were warriors forged to enforce order, symbols of authority whose presence could inspire loyalty or instill terror. The church proclaimed them defenders of Christendom, chosen instruments to guard the weak and extend the faith. Yet kings and feudal lords saw them differently, as weapons, vital to securing borders, crushing rebellions, and upholding dynasties. Knights became both sword and shield of the ruling elite, embodiments of a power structure that demanded obedience through steel. For common people, the image was never so glorious. To peasants bound by taxes and servitude, knights were double-edged figures, protectors in times of invasion, oppressors in times of peace. The same warrior who raised his blade against foreign raiders might, days later, enforce brutal levies on villagers unable to pay. In their eyes, chivalry was not romance, but survival under the shadow of armored riders. Across the countryside, castles crowned the hills, towering above fragile settlements. These fortresses were not merely symbols of security. They were daily reminders that true justice did not come from law or court, but from the sword. The so-called code of honor, loyalty, bravery, and mercy, was invoked often, but molded easily to the convenience of kings and lords. In practice, the ideal bent to ambition, shaping knights into both guardians and predators. Thus, medieval England was defined by this paradox. Knights were celebrated as protectors of virtue, yet their hands were often stained with the suffering of those they swore to defend. They were not just warriors of faith or servants of kings, they were instruments of a system that fused politics, religion, and violence into the very fabric of society. The road to knighthood was long, harsh, and unforgiving. It began in childhood, when at the age of 7 a noble boy was taken from the warmth of his family home and placed in the household of a lord. There he became a page, serving at tables, learning manners, and studying the arts of courtesy. But beneath the lessons of refinement lay the foundations of discipline. Every movement, every silence, every act of obedience was designed to mold the child into something more than himself, into a vessel prepared for the burden of war. By 14, the page was transformed into a squire. His life was no longer polished halls and minor tasks, but the raw brutality of the battlefield. He carried his lord's shield, tended to wounded horses, sharpened blood-stained blades, and often cleaned the armor still warm from combat. A squire witnessed death at close range, from the cries of soldiers gutted in the mud to the flames of villages left in ruin. Each experience pressed iron into his soul, forging resilience through exposure to suffering. It was training not only of the body, but of the mind, a relentless preparation for the life of a warrior. The final step was the adoubement, the ceremony of knighthood. Cloaked in solemn ritual, the young man fasted, bathed in purification, and kept vigil through the night in prayer. At dawn, he knelt before his lord, receiving the touch of the sword and the sacred title of knight. To onlookers, it was a moment of sanctity, a union of faith and valor. Yet behind the candles and prayers stood politics and reward. With knighthood came land, privilege, and the sanctioned right to seize spoils of war. The ritual sanctified ambition as much as devotion. Thus the knight was more than a soldier. He was an emblem of noble authority, a weapon legitimized by faith. But contradictions lay at his core. The same man who swore to protect the innocent could turn predator on the battlefield. England was not crafting saints, it was forging men of steel, trained to uphold both the shining myth of chivalry and the darker truths of power and conquest. The height of English knighthood revealed itself in the fires of the Crusades. Answering the call of the Pope, they marched across continents, clad in steel and mounted on powerful steeds, banners adorned with crimson crosses fluttering in the desert winds. To the world, it appeared as if heaven itself had unleashed its chosen warriors to reclaim the Holy Land. The mission was cloaked in sanctity: liberate Jerusalem, defend the faith, secure the glory of God's kingdom. But beneath the hymns and prayers, the truth was darker. The cross they bore on their shields was not only a symbol of devotion, it became the banner of ambition. Cities fell to their fury, gates were shattered, temples desecrated, and blood spilled without mercy. Innocents were cut down in the streets, and entire communities vanished under the charge of men who proclaimed themselves soldiers of Christ. In their wake, ashes and silence testified to a contradiction too great to ignore: defenders of the faith who destroyed in the name of holiness. Nor was England spared the shadow. At home, during the Wars of the Roses, knights ravaged their own land. Villages burned, harvests rotted under torchlight, and the fragile lives of peasants were crushed beneath hooves and steel. The sacred code of chivalry, so often praised in poems, dissolved in the chaos of civil strife. What remained was not honor, but the hunger for dominance. To the common people, knights were no longer noble champions, but tormentors whose armor glinted not with justice, but with oppression. Yet even in this darkness, their presence commanded awe. Their cavalry charges shattered enemy lines like thunder, and their very image struck terror into hearts. Knights embodied both the pinnacle of military might and the depths of moral failure. The climax of English chivalry was not merely its glory, but its greatest contradiction: a force that claimed to defend faith while spreading fear, that promised honor while sowing destruction. It was here, in this collision of devotion and brutality, that the myth of the knight reached its brightest brilliance and its darkest shadow. The end of the knight's supremacy arrived not with a single battle, but with the slow thunder of change. Gunpowder, once a curiosity from the East, became the instrument that shattered centuries of tradition. Cannons roared across battlefields, their fire reducing castles to rubble. Muskets pierced through layers of steel once thought invincible. The proud charge of cavalry, long the most feared maneuver of war, was broken by the smoke and lead of firearms. The knight, once master of the battlefield, was now a relic struggling against the march of progress. At the same time, the political landscape transformed. Kings consolidated power, no longer relying on feudal bonds, but on professional armies paid in coin, not loyalty. The knight's oath to his lord meant little when monarchs commanded thousands of trained soldiers. Stripped of purpose, many knights wandered into decline. Some hired their swords to foreign wars as mercenaries. Others fell into infamy, reduced to highwaymen preying on the very peasants they once claimed to protect. The once glorious figure of the armored horseman became, in many cases, a symbol of desperation. For the common people, this decline was not mourned. The knight, who had long embodied both protection and oppression, was increasingly seen as an outdated relic of cruelty. The vaunted code of chivalry, immortalized in songs, revealed itself as an illusion, a mask for ambition. Armors rusted in forgotten halls, gathering dust, while poets still sang of virtues that reality had long abandoned. The contradiction between myth and memory widened, leaving knights suspended between reverence and disdain. Yet the fall of chivalry was not painless. With knights fading, villages lost defenders, and noble households lost their traditional backbone. Families of squires and retainers, once sustained by the knightly class, faced ruin. England itself had to reinvent its art of war, trading the spectacle of mounted valor for the cold precision of organized strategy. The knight's decline was more than the end of a warrior. It was the signal of a world shifting irreversibly, where the age of steel and honor gave way to the age of gunpowder, statecraft, and new forms of power. Though their power crumbled, the knights of England never vanished from memory. In fact, their decline only fueled their transformation into legend. Chroniclers, poets, and later novelists recast them not as flawed men of flesh and iron, but as paladins of virtue. The reality of scorched villages and blood-soaked fields faded, replaced by tales of noble quests, of Arthur and his round table, of grails sought and evils vanquished. It was easier and far more comforting for societies to remember the knight as a symbol of courage than as a reminder of cruelty. Thus the myth grew brighter even as the truth grew darker. Behind the legend, however, the contradiction endured. Knights were both guardians and oppressors, builders of order and agents of chaos. They embodied discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice, yet also ambition, greed, and destruction. This duality is their truest legacy. They reflect not only the ideals humanity longs for, but also the shadows it cannot escape. To study them is to confront our own nature, for within their story lies the eternal struggle between virtue and corruption. Even in modern times, their image persists. Films, novels, and cultural myths continue to glorify the knight as an icon of honor, courage, and romance. Children dream of shining armor. Leaders invoke the language of chivalry to justify battles of their own. Yet history whispers a different story, that glory and darkness are inseparable companions. The knight who defended the weak could also exploit them. The warrior who prayed before combat might torch a village hours later. The myth inspires, but the truth sobers. Thus, the legacy of English chivalry is twofold. On one side stands the radiant legend, knights as eternal beacons of valor, faith, and sacrifice. On the other stands the harsher reality, warriors whose swords carved both justice and injustice into the soul of their age. To remember them is not merely to honor the dream, but to acknowledge the nightmare. For in their rise and fall, the knights of England remind us that every age of light casts a shadow, and that the human heart forever carries both.